Hello, my name is Dr. Paul Lynch. I'm an inclusive education and early years senior lecturer in the School of Education in Glasgow University. And I'm delighted to be with you virtually on this recording. I was asked to provide some information, some slides, a presentation based on a review of the pre-primary program for children with special needs in Ethiopia. So I look forward to sharing some ideas with you over the next 25 minutes. So, so the terms of reference were based on 6 questions. You'll be able to read those in the report. Hopefully you've had time to have a look at the review I produced, and we're really looking forward to hearing your feedback, your expert advice on some of the ideas, recommendations, reflections in the report. So this presentation is a sort of summary of those ideas, but it's also looking at some of the international practice that I mention in the report. And so hopefully some of the ideas you'll be able to take forward in your discussions during this workshop. So the main focus was to look at ways of exploring supporting early years development, particularly for children with special needs, or I commonly call, say, children with disabilities or special educational needs in Ethiopia. And it's really important for us to think about ways of developing teacher training, methodological support, what sorts of materials we need to help develop children's development, particularly those who have a delay or are experiencing a specific disability like blindness or deafness or an intellectual disability. So as part of the review, I looked at a number of key policy documents, the preschool curricula, preschool teacher training program that you are running, a particular focus on inclusive pedagogies for the O class, which is primarily what we were looking at, was the aspects of the O class and how we can be more supportive of including children with disabilities in these classes. And also thinking about how we identify and assess children with special needs. And I think that's a growing area of concern for many of us working in this area. And then also looked at the ECEC inclusion manual. So reviewing all these documents was really helpful to give me a backdrop of what's happening at the moment in Ethiopia with regards to early childhood education and care. Just as a sort of background, I thought it'd be quite useful to look at this graph, which looks at the development of the brain over the first 50 weeks of a child's development, so the first 2 years of a child's life. And as many of you know, that the development of the brain, there's an awful lot of activity. We talk about the plasticity, the ability of the brain to absorb so much information in the first 2 years of life. And as you can see from this graph, that from 20 weeks, it actually goes up exponentially, that there's this period of rapid growth from 20 to 50 weeks in terms of developing cells, what we call myelination, and then that development of synapses, so that synaptic genesis, which is very important. And this is done through interaction, allowing the child to explore their environment, their immediate environment and around them, and to develop their sense of self. So that's a really important background. Also, I'd like to show you this slide, which has been published in the Lancet in 2007. And of course, it shows the sort of longitude, the movement of the human brain. And what's really important is that the child shows brain development. And there are what we call rich windows of opportunity over the particularly over the first 2 to 3 years. So, for example, the child learns very basic skills for the rest of their life through their seeing, hearing, understanding, through language acquisition and understanding language. So we see from this graph that the seeing and hearing develops from the first month right up to the 6th and 7th months, so primarily vision and hearing, receptive language and speaking from 8 months to 2 years. And then this idea of higher cognitive functions, the ability to problem solve between 7 months up to 10 years and later on. So there's this real big development, this big activity during the early periods of life. And what I like to think about is to what extent, if for example, a child is blind, how they miss out on that important development of seeing, considering the fact that we do receive up to 70% of the information through our vision. So with the loss of sight, what alternative ways can we help a child develop in order to ensure that the child experiences brain development over the early years? So something we've developed, and also I'm sure you are aware of, is this idea of biological systems perspective to support children with disabilities. And I've just put a screenshot of a paper that I co-wrote with some authors based on a project in Malawi. And it's based on this systems of approach, which you probably know about, where we have the child in the center and we have the sort of microsystem around the child, which is the family, the immediate community, the school, the town and village, and all those active ingredients or agents that support the child. And the arrows show that it's a two-way process, that the child is not a passive being. The child is interacting, is able to make judgments, preferences, and choices, as long as the information and materials are brought to the child at the right time. And as we move out across, we've got the mesosystem, which is more looking at other agencies, maybe community-based rehabilitation, other therapists who can feed into helping the child and supporting the family through the transition from home to early years, out to the social welfare, to the engagement with the national curriculum, particularly the ECEC program. And then we have the macro system, which is at your level in terms of what is done in terms of policy decisions, and also the impact of international declarations like the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And running along the bottom is this idea of this movement, this process is ongoing from home, transitioning to early years, primary school, secondary school, etc., into livelihood. So I think it's quite a useful concept to frame what we're thinking about in developing the child. Another model that is very useful and also in considering early childhood development is school readiness. And that's something that has been discussed quite widely in the literature, also in Ethiopia, is how do we ensure that the child is ready for school? What needs to be in place to support that child's transition into school? So this model considers school readiness not just within the child, but within the school, the family and communities, and that it's a bi-directional, two-way process to make sure that the child, that the onus, that the responsibility is not on the child being expected to be able to go to the toilet independently, be able to respond to their name, be able to feed themselves, that this onus, this responsibility is shared across the parents, the community and the school. So the idea is to ensure that there is a development of stronger relationships between the school, the parents, and that the transition process is done early on and is not done on the day the child arrives at the early childhood or the O class. And so early childhood education in the center in terms of readiness plays a pivotal role in preparing the child and the parents and the community for early childhood development. So we now move on to identifying and assessing children with disabilities. This is something which is really important in early childhood development. It's trying to identify those children who are not performing as well as they should be at their chronological age. So again, many of you will probably know about the Washington Group questions, and they have been used in Ethiopia. It's a very simple questionnaire that's applied to parents. Parents are asked a set of questions on different domains about how well a child is performing or functioning in terms of seeing, hearing, walking, communicating, playing, etc. And so the interviewer asks questions to the extent, is a child able to see well, a lot has difficulty seeing, or maybe cannot see at all. And as soon as one of these, if a child experiences a lot of difficulty or cannot do that at all, it should indicate what we call a red flag. And this should be followed up as soon as possible through clinical assessment, or a more sophisticated assessment afterwards. So the Washington Group questions are a very useful starting point for teachers, parents, and could be used very easily for children from 2 to 4, and then there's another one from 5 to 17 years. If we're thinking about the classroom experience, and I know a lot of you are thinking about this in terms of how to support teachers in the classroom, there are other ways. For example, there's a very simple questionnaire that's available in terms of identifying functional difficulties based on observation. And observation is a very useful way of measuring, of seeing how well a child performs doing a task like cutting paper, using MARD, demonstrating fine motor, maybe walking, skipping, jumping, ability to express themselves, etc. And so there are tools like this one, which helps identify those concerns that a teacher or a caregiver has. And these can be discussed with the parent, who usually can give you much more information, checking whether the child is attending a clinic or hospital, and then thinking about referral of the child to a clinic. And then there are basic questions. I've just put up a couple around hearing. If the child is experiencing hearing, when you watch, is the child watching your lips when you speak? If you don't face the child, is the child able to respond correctly? Does the child have problems speaking? And then we have, for understanding, different milestones in terms of what they should be able to do. So there are different methods of assessment through direct observation, which we've just looked at, asking children to carry out specific tasks and checking to see whether they are able to do them easily or with difficulty, and making a note of this. It's really important that we note this down and that we don't forget about it, and that maybe a child's having an off day, or the child has had an upsetting or traumatic experience. So we need to keep that in mind when we're asking children to perform certain activities. There could be things by verbal reporting by parent or teacher. So that again is something that needs to be recognized. And again, through unstructured observation. I think that's really important, that we don't formalize observation too much at the beginning, and that we do make mental notes, written notes as well, about the difficulty children are experiencing. So one example, again, this particular tool, some of you are maybe aware of it. It has been used in Ethiopia. It's called the Malawi Development Assessment Tool, the MDAT. And this is quite a useful assessment, more formal assessment, to help identify what we call neurodevelopmental delay or disability. So that's mainly problems around gross, fine motor, social, being able to socialize and able to use language appropriately. And this test can start from birth right up to just under 6 years. It's quite a very extensive assessment, takes about 30 minutes, but the trainer needs to be, the person assessing needs to have some training and there needs to be some standardization across the trainers to make sure they are doing it correctly. And this is called inter-rater reliability. And this is just a screenshot of part of the test. As you can see on the left, it starts at birth right up to 5+, and it's broken down into the 4 domains which I've mentioned. And this can be, the MDAT also has, the MDAT website has some useful videos to show how to carry out, carry out that activity. So some of it's parent reporting, but a lot of the task is asking the child to perform a task. For example, in terms of social, is to be able to indicate a way of pointing their wants. Can they point at what they want to touch, able to dress themselves, put their shorts on, etc., able to go to the toilet competently. And then in terms of fine motor, it's able to stack blocks, say 4 blocks on top of each other, and do some simple drawings. So that's an assessment that could be used in the classroom to help identify any problems. Now, moving on to something which is also part of the sort of identification assessment of children is the assessment centres. And I've given an example here in Kenya. Kenya has what's called the EARCs, which are the Educational Assessment and Resource Centres. And these centres are set up across Kenya in the counties and sub-counties. And they've developed what's called the minimum quality standards. And these are the sort of minimum elements that are required for each centre in terms of a minimum number of assessors to assess a child. So there's ideas around thematic areas of management accountability. How do we do that? What infrastructure needs to be in place in terms of the building? Where should the building be placed? How accessible is it? And the roles and responsibilities of the assessment officers and its work as an outreach as well. So not just receiving children, but teams going out to homes and schools to assess children. And then the really important is, what are the qualifications? What's the minimum qualifications we would expect teachers, assessors to have in terms of being able to carry out those assessments? And what are those assessment procedures? And come up to some agreement. It may be the MDAT, maybe the Washington group questions. It could be a combination of both. So it's agreeing on those. And then it really essentially is having a clear itinerary of materials, assessment equipment, and assistive devices. And these should be the same across all the centres. Now in Ethiopia, you have similar set of centres called the IOCs, which is slightly different, but based on very similar principles. And I looked at your good practice, the implementation of inclusive education resource centres in Ethiopia. Very similar ideas based on multidisciplinary teams carrying out assessments. But what's really interesting is that you have this idea of the itinerant teacher playing a very pivotal role in bringing teams together. So the itinerant teacher has that training, that specialist knowledge that can bring those teams together. What's very difficult, and it's the case in many countries, even in countries where I live in the United Kingdom, it's very difficult to bring a whole multidisciplinary team together, to have a psychologist, to have therapists, speech and language therapists. It's called the dream team, and it's very, very difficult to do. So what can we do in terms of minimum requirements to assess a child? So the child may need to be assessed on several occasions, or you might need 2 or 3 areas. And so the Washington group questions can be useful in identifying whether a child has a visual problem, hearing problem with understanding, and find the experts who can come together rather than having a whole team, which can be very costly and difficult to organize. It's also important to have someone who has a complete understanding of the equipment. So what equipment is good for understanding whether a child is able to see properly, is able to hear things, is able to do puzzles, is able to use their ability to problem solve. So one person does need those skills, and whether it's the itinerant teacher or another person, that needs to be decided. And you do have these managers in the centre, and they seem to be a really important role. The idea, I think, is to expand those centres. I think the idea to 500, which does require a lot of resources. The other thing is that in this good practice guide, there didn't seem to be much discussion on early years. So I think it would be important to think about what specific training and resources are required to support children, to help assessors understand development in the very early years of 3 to 5 years, for example. And then also to look at ways of working with the networks of community-based rehabilitation, which exist in Ethiopia. Look at how you can bring in the health sector, whether there is an occupational therapist that could bring in and provide training. So the idea is bringing in different personnel to help with the assessment of children with disabilities. An occupational therapist would be good for children with cerebral palsy or problems with stiff joints, to give some help to parents on therapy. So now moving on to pre-primary education, pre-primary training. So something I have worked on was an inclusive training resource at the National Early Childhood Development Centre as part of their training program. And so what we developed, we looked at the existing caregiver training program, which was a 2-week program, and looked at ways of integrating inclusive education, disability awareness into that existing program. And again, that's something I've noticed as well, that in your policy, in your guidelines, there is that starting to bring in elements, but there still needs to be more detail about understanding disability, what sort of gains you can use in terms of supporting children. And there's an image here of using a parachute, and an image of children, of teachers training, and they're all sitting down, so that helps facilitate children who cannot stand. And it's a great game to use for multiple purposes. The other picture shows a teacher pretending to be blind, and another teacher sort of giving them tactile materials and supporting them in doing maths. So there's importance around developing literacy development, storytelling, safety and risk management, early maths, environment, inclusive environment, and working with parents with disabilities. So it's coming up with this holistic program, this whole center school approach to supporting children with disabilities. Another tool which is available is by eNet, and again, some of you may know about this Inclusive Education Network, and they have some excellent materials on inclusive education. And more recently, they've put up some videos to help train on early years. And I thought this quote, "All young learners, girls and boys, whatever their race, language, religion, disability, refugee or other status, should be able to learn together in their local community." And that's a very important message, is that we don't really think about sending children out of their community. They should be, as well as possible, supported within their own community. Although I do recognize the need for teaching of sign language, teaching of Braille, teaching of other additional curriculum areas that may need to be taught in other places when the child gets older. So this video-based resource is an excellent tool that could be used as part of your preschool teacher training. And then there are other resources. This is another from Save the Children in Sri Lanka that came up with a very helpful resource book for teachers in 2006. And I think it's an excellent tool. It provides teachers with knowledge and skills to enable them to include children with disability in preschools or O classes. And a really lovely idea of having different case study children. And I talk about this in the review, is this idea of having, say, a child who is blind give them a name, a child who's deaf, and think about that child each time you're contemplating or planning an activity. So how would a blind child be able to participate in an outdoor activity without getting hurt? How would a deaf child be able to follow a story if the teacher is need to sit them in the right place? So there's a whole range of small things that can be done that don't necessarily cost much, but teachers still need a minimum amount of guidance on what to do. So this is a great tips for teachers. It's a very useful tool and it's free. Another aspect is in enhancing the learning environment that the child attends, so attending the O class or the preschool. And many of you are aware of the UDL, Universal Design for Learning. So we have this framework which has been used not just for disability, but for inclusion of all children. And this is a useful framework which gives children with disabilities more opportunities to make choices about what they want to do and what's relevant to their lives. So is it relevant to ask them to keep writing their name or using written tasks when they're really not going to be able to write much when they get older? So it's really thinking about what are those functional skills that a child needs to get them through to becoming more independent. And the UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, helps teachers, helps parents, helps other experts to think about more sort of play-based activities for children, which allow children to explore their environment and choose what they want to do. And so the three circles show the different levels of, say, technology that is required. So you might need something very specific to support a child to see, for example, a pair of glasses or a magnifier, whereas more sort of open-ended activities like a tablet could be used by lots of children with or without disabilities. Another tool that's been used across Africa and other countries is the ECHAS, the Early Childhood Environment Rating Scale. And this again is a very useful observation. It's observing the environment and it's using a number of subscales. And this has been very helpful for helping supervisors, helping head teachers, teachers themselves to look at their own practice. So it's a sort of peer-to-peer practice, so critical peering, peer work. And it really helps people to get a sense of how they're performing in the class in terms of routine and structure, supervising children. And there's an adaptation that's been developed by myself and colleagues that gives scores to help score. So you could do an observation at the beginning of term one and then go back towards the end of the year to see how things have changed. And what's really important is there's a subscale for provision for children with disabilities. Moving on, also in thinking about access, something that an NGO, Sightsavers, has done, and I was doing some support for as well, was how do we get children from home to school to the early childhood centres? Parents were talking about having to carry their children long distance, and that prevented them sometimes from going because of bad weather or because they needed to work, or they were just really tired, or the child was too heavy. So we came up with the idea of having carriers on the back of bicycles. And bicycles were used by the caregivers. They went out to collect the child and bring them to the centre and then take them back. And this helped parents immensely, so they didn't need to go to the centre and walk through maybe 2-3 kilometres each time. That freed them up to go to work, to do their own activities. So I talked a little bit about technology, but and also in the review, I think there needs to be more reflection perhaps on the use of educational technology in the classroom or edtech. International evidence shows that preschool teacher development programs do not seem to be incorporating high quality competency skills that are improving their digital literacy. Many of us have phones, we have these mobile phones, we have Android phones like this one, Samsung. There is much we can do in terms of downloading apps, helping teachers record those observations that they can make, which I spoke about at the beginning of this presentation. So apps, using different types of apps can really increase children's accessibility. And I think there's a real gap in training in helping children, in helping teachers to help children access the curriculum. So I think there's an important area of using portable devices to record children's learning outcomes. So moving to the final part of the presentation, thanks for staying with me. And these are elaborated more in the review, but I just thought I'd pick out a few of them. So I think there's a real importance of augmenting, I talk about this idea of augmenting, increasing teachers' existing pedagogy skills on early years, on preschool development, to ensure that they understand this idea of the whole child, that we use more what we call participatory pedagogical approaches, which means that the teacher is actually hands-on, is doing a lot of practical work rather than theoretical understanding, that they apply what they learned with children, with a small group of children pretty much straight away. So it's good to even have that training in a school where they have access to children. And the idea of including activities that promote the rights of children with disabilities. So making sure that all children with disabilities have some level of participations. And that again increases their well-being, it increases their happiness and involvement. And of course, parents notice that straight away. They will tell you that their children are coming home much happier. And so there's a need to link up more, to have strong dialogues with parents and encourage parents to be more supportive at home. And they can develop literacy, doing literacy, maths, singing songs. And teachers, once they get some basic ideas, can give parents ideas of daily activities they do in the O class that they can also do at home. I talked briefly at the beginning about a framework, and it'd be really, I think, quite powerful to think about how the different agencies, the multi-sector partners, work together, interact to support the child at the community, the sub-zonal and bigger levels. And there's this importance, again, of changing the mindset of preschool teachers towards disability. And I think one way of doing that is to demonstrate through role play, through role models, to show that children can learn, they can succeed, they can adapt, they can enjoy being in the same environment as their non-disabled peers. And this can be done through positive examples and talking these examples through with parents. I also looked at the family health package for health extension workers and community health promoters to ensure that key aspects of identification referral are covered throughout the package. I think that could be enhanced further. I think it's a great tool, and maybe some more pictures, more diagrams could really boost that, and that could be disseminated more widely across the country. And also explore the use of assistive technology, EdTech, in supporting children with disabilities, the use of apps on Android phones, and then the minimum standards for setting up and running of IX, Inclusive Education Resource Centres, and boost the training of itinerant teachers to identify and assess children with disabilities in their early years. one example, and I have given more examples in the review, is the adaptation of the O-class curriculum. And, just taking, for example, I've taken this outdoor games to be more inclusive. And it just requires very simple changes of language, checking the language. So if a child is unable to use their legs or able to jump, is use other words like move or shuffle on their bottom, kneel, lie down, using materials so that they don't get dirty or hurt. It's just thinking out those requirements. Or if a child has a visual impairment, finding ways of miming animals, choosing animals that they would encounter, like a goat or a hen. You might have some toys that they can touch. So it's increasing their access to different materials and thinking about the children in your class and what are their restrictions and how can we address those. So changes to the curriculum don't require too much material resources, and this can be done even further, and some more examples are in the review. So I'd like to hear your responses to that. Another recommendation is to think, as I talked about, is the holistic approach. So children as whole learners, and they can lead the way. Children are able to lead the way on what they like and what they don't like to do. This is called child-initiated learning, and I'm sure many of you in this room have support this, have used it in your own training. And the ECCE Inclusion Handbook has this, includes this information, and I think that's really fantastic. And the ways of developing that further in terms of supporting transition from O class to primary class through this holistic approach, which is very much part of the early childhood development agenda. Just to finish off, I know we've been through and we are still going through many challenges as a result of COVID-19. And a lot of children have missed out on vital learning. And part of this is the ability to socialize and play with their peers. And if they've been cut off from that, it's difficult, particularly for children with disabilities, to become a lot more shy, frightened. And so there's a necessity to build up that confidence to have more positive impact on their psychosocial and emotional well-being. So we need to be cognizant of the physical health, the finances, the education, the food security, all these aspects which you are completely aware of. And in terms of building in that extra time to allow children with disabilities to get used to being back in an environment where they're not with their parents and re-establishing those friendships. And that does take time. So we need to build that in as we move along. And just some final points. Again, please, I'm delighted you have this workshop so you can discuss some of these ideas further. Consider the feasibility of the next steps that are in the report, in the review for your own work. And do you think that any examples of international practice that I shared could be implemented, could be piloted, could be used in any way? You've already got a lot going on already in terms of guides. Is there a way of consolidating them, simplifying them, making them into one booklet or several booklets? Perhaps explore that further. UNESCO have come up with a recent publication, which I've given you a link, Inclusive Early Childhood Care and Education. So from commitment to action. So that's where we are, I think, in terms of there's been quite a lot of discussion about what we should do, but now we need to move into that action stage, because children, as we've shown, are really ready to get back to develop, and we can't lose that momentum. So I really hope that you have a look at that. And I'm really sorry I can't be with you, but I'm sure I welcome any of your emails, your reactions, feedback, and I look forward to interacting with you on another occasion. So I thank you very much for your attention. I apologize if I went on a bit long, but I do hope you have a good rest of workshop. Thank you. Bye-bye.